I live in a city with a public transportation system. They've been extremely short-staffed, and more often than not, you have to call to make sure your bus is even coming. On weekdays, during business hours, the public transit operator will order a lift for you to get to work if your bus isn't showing up or if they're short a driver. Tuesday, I'm at the bus stop after checking multiple times if my bus is coming, only to find out that it wasn't. They ordered me a lift, and this nice older gentleman was my driver. We had casual conversation, and he started to ask personal questions. I'm a bartender, and I'm super friendly already, so I didn't think his questions were ill-intentioned. Told him I'm not married and that I'm pretty much a loner. I basically go to work and go home and spend my time with family. He then says, "I'd marry you in a heartbeat." Again, I'm just thinking that he's being funny or nice. I asked him to drop me off at the downtown grocery so I could pick up some things that I needed for work. When we stopped, he said he was joking, that he's married and has a son my age. Asked if I was interested in maybe meeting him. Since I have a terrible track record, I figured it wouldn't hurt meeting someone out of my circle and comfort zone, so I gave the man my number and we parted ways. The next morning, he texted me and asked if I needed a ride to work. I told him he didn't have to do that and that I was sure my bus was running. He said it would be his pleasure and that he'd pick me up at my house at 3 p.m. Then about an hour later, he asked if I wanted to have lunch with him before work. I told him I was busy and that I couldn't do that. He said, "Okay, see you at 3. He shows up right at 3 and lets me know that he's outside. While I'm finishing getting my things together, I open the door and he's starting to walk up my stairs to my house. I told him I was ready and we could head downtown. When I get in the back seat, he turns around and says that he has a confession. He told me from the time I took off my mask, his heart danced like a butterfly. He said that he hasn't been able to stop thinking about me since the day before and that he'd love to spend time with me and that he'd pay me for my time if I spent a day with him. That's when I started to feel super uncomfortable. The whole ride was making me cringe, but know that when you're in a situation like that with the predator, playing nice is sometimes safer than freaking out. He continued on the entire ride about how he loved me at first sight and wanted to make me his Lebanese queen. As we got closer to downtown, I started to feel relief. He dropped me off at my hotel and said, "See you tomorrow." That evening at work, I checked my phone after a bust happy hour and he's texted me a couple of times. He sent a picture of the hotel and said that he'd wait for me to get off to give me a ride home. I told him I already had a ride, but thank you anyways. Thursday morning, I'm out running errands with my mom and sister. He texts me and asks how early he can pick me up because he can't stop thinking about me. I asked him to please stop and that I was with family. He continues to text me all day and evening, begging to see me and telling me his heart is aching to see his Lebanese queen. I just kept saying to please stop. Now Friday morning is where stuff hit the fan. He tells me he loves me no matter what. He said I told my wife about you and that I'm in love with you and I want a divorce. I told him to please don't do that and that it wasn't right to treat his wife that way. He said it wasn't my fault. They were drifting apart anyways. Then he said I'm picking up for dinner at 5:30 and I'm not taking no for an answer. I ignored the messages during the day and just went about my off day. At around 5:25, my video doorbell rings and he's standing on my porch for at least 15 minutes. I told him I wasn't home and that he should leave. He continues to text me and even begs to come pick me up from my parents. I was home the whole time, but I was just too scared to let him know that. I eventually called the non-emergency police station, but he had already left by the time I got through. I filed a general report, but technically they can't do anything unless he's standing on my porch threatening me. They advised me to make a report through Lyft, so I did. And I haven't heard anything since then, but honestly, that was one of the most threatening and creepy moments of my life. I've also attached the doorbell footage so you can get an idea of what he's like.
Come on, open up, please. Be sweet. disappoint me, please. Yeah.
I was a bad kid. And no, I'm not talking about your regular teenage delinquency like trying cigarettes, school detentions, or getting bad grades. I mean really bad. By age 17, I was shoplifting, stealing cars, getting picked up by cops for all sorts of things. Not exactly hurting anyone, but I was a constant headache for my mom and dad. Then after me and Dad almost got into an actual fistfight, he kicked me out of the house. I know I deserved it, and I know they figured I'd just go stay with friends for a couple of days because that's exactly what I did. But me being me, I quickly wore out my welcome at my buddies' houses and ran out of places to stay. But again, me being me, I was way too proud to just go home and apologize. Since it was summertime, I figured it'd be a good idea to head down to the park to find somewhere to sleep. Now, I lived in the inner city back then, so there was a bunch of other actual homeless people already sleeping there. And as soon as I realized I was actually stuck out there for a night, I started to realize that this homeless thing wasn't a game anymore. As it started to get really late, I got to the park at around 11 p.m. and it was like 1 a.m. by the time this happened. One of the homeless dudes walked up to me as I started to bed down on a bench and started talking to me. He asked what I was doing, and being naive, I told him, "I'm homeless." He immediately responded by saying, "No, you're not," and pretty much guessed the whole deal about me having a falling out with my mom and dad. I didn't want to admit that he was exactly right, so I just kept my mouth shut. But I remember him saying something like, "Really though, kid, if you have kin, you need to pay him a visit because I promise, you ain't ready for this life." My pride kept me out there for 3 whole nights, and every single time I curled up on that bench, the same old homeless dude would walk up and be like, "Go home, kid. This ain't you." In hindsight, he was exactly right, but at the time, he was just another person to prove wrong. My final night on the streets also happened to be the first that I tried to ingratiate myself with the homeless folk who slept in the park, partially out of boredom, partially out of hunger. I'd run out of money, run out of food, and I figured if I hung out with the other guys, I could maybe get in on some of their food or something. I asked around, but no one had any spares. Until I asked this one guy, and he told me to buzz off, and I noticed a Snickers bar sticking out of his coat pocket. My rumbling stomach basically just overrode my brain, and with all the dexterity of a Victorian pickpocket, I slid the thing out of his pocket and walked off. Not my proudest moment, stealing food from a homeless guy when I could have just swallowed my pride and walked home, but it is what it is. So I go off to hide somewhere so I can devour the Snickers whole, then I walk back to where the other guys are to hang out some more. Maybe like 2 or 3 hours later, I'm still trying to ingratiate myself with the homeless guys, but I'm also still pretty nervous around them for obvious reasons. I figured the guy I stole from is too drunk to even notice that I stole from him. But oh boy, was I wrong about that. Because like I said, a few hours after I stole it, I noticed the guy began to tap his coat pocket, obviously noticing that the candy bar is gone. I'm trying to remain inconspicuous, but I'm also trying to keep my eye on the guy because if he put 2 and 2 together and worked out that it was me that stole from him, I wanted enough warning to be able to get out of there. So the guy taps his pocket, and when he stops, I can see the cogs turning in his booze-soaked brain as I figured he was thinking, pretty sure I had some candy in there. But then a few seconds later, he's back taking pulls from his 40-ounce like he'd completely forgotten about the whole thing. Only, he hadn't. And the most shocking thing about what came next was how it went from 0 to 100 in like a second flat. So remember that pull of his 40? He takes 1, then 2, then a third much longer one, almost like he was trying to polish the whole thing off in a hurry, which as it turned out, was exactly what he was doing, because what was once an innocent beverage receptacle soon became a weapon. When he turned to the guy to his right and sent the glass 40 bottle smashing into his face, the guy just collapsed hands covering his face, same hands with muffled blood-curdling screams that he let out. The guy I stole from then started kicking the life out of him. "Steal from me? Steal from me, mother effer?" And out of all the homeless people there, only one actually tried to break it up. And even then, it was just a slurred, "Hey, break it up over there," which ended up being totally ignored. I remember turning to the older dude who'd been nice to me, telling me to go home and whatnot, and I feigned ignorance as I asked him what was going on. The guy said the dude getting beat down was always stealing stuff, so if anything went missing around the park, it was most probably his fault. No one cared though. No one gave a single worry that this guy was getting his face stomped on, and it was all my fault. Oh, and I mean stomped on. I could hear this guy's face literally crunching under the guy's boot. I knew I should have said something. I know I should have owned up, but believe me when I tell you that I've never been that scared. Not before or after. All I could think of was, if I tell the truth, that'll be my face getting stamped on, only it'll probably be like 100 times worse because, well, look what I caused. I turned to the nice guy and was like, but what if he didn't steal it? What if someone else stole it? The guy looked at me and his eyes went all wide and he leaned in and said, "Don't say a word, kid. Just leave. Leave and never, ever come back." As I walked away, I could still hear the guy getting his butt beat, and although I never found out what happened to him, I don't see anyone being able to survive the kind of head injuries he got. That very same night, maybe at around 2 a.m., I walked back to my parents' house and banged on the front door until my dad woke up and answered. I just blurted out this big, long apology about being a total idiot and not appreciating what I'd had. I'm pleased to say that that was the first step on the road to being a decent human being, because almost everything I did before that had little to no consequences, or rather, what little there were didn't bother me. But that night I stole the candy bar, I actually saw how bad the repercussions could be, and honestly, I had no idea they could ever be that bad, just for taking a candy bar. I feel equal parts shame and horror when I look back on it. My pride and greed caused me to do something shameful, and my cowardice might have cost a relatively innocent man's life. I wish it had never happened, but at the same time, if it didn't, who knows? I might be still hanging out in that park today, if I'd even be alive at all. There are two main components to the story. One, I used to make money on the side by selling the loot from storage unit auctions on Craigslist. Two, my brother spent some time in prison for almost killing a guy in a car accident while he was under the influence. Part 1 of the story takes place while my brother was in prison, and Part 2 is the weekend of his release about 6 or 7 months later. Part 1. I bought the keys to this one storage unit that had a whole bunch of cool stuff in it. We're talking a big flat-screen LED TV, back when those were still brand new, a laptop computer, and 3 vintage motorcycles. As you can imagine, I was pretty much over the moon, and after I posted the Craigslist ads and the replies started pouring in, I knew I was on track to make a ton of money. The only trouble was I didn't really have any place to keep the bikes, so much to my wife's anger, I kept one in the garage, one in the TV room, and the smaller dirt bike in the hallway of our house. The only thing that kept her off my back was the promise that they'd fetch us a lot of cash, and in the advertisement I posted on Craigslist, I promised to knock 20% off the total asking price if someone bought all the bikes together, even more if the offer came fast enough. And what do you know? It seemed to work. I got a call a few days later from a guy who was offering cash for all 3 bikes. He could also bring his own bike trailer over to transport them away, which really was the answer to my prayers. So, the guy arranges a trailer, then calls me again one evening to confirm my address. I pass on my details and he says he'll be stopping by in the morning. But during the call, every so often I had to stop giving the address so I could shush my 2-year-old who was apparently still discovering just how loud they could yell. So more than once I had to apologize and start over. The guy looking to buy the bikes seemed like a little annoyed. Like the kind of annoyed when you know someone doesn't have kids of their own, but he still said he'd be over in the morning to pick them up. The next morning comes, I've got the bike all ready to go, but 10 a.m. comes and goes and there's no sign of the buyer. 10:30 a.m. rolls around and there's still no show, so I try giving the guy a call, only to find the phone had been disconnected. He wasn't just ducking me. He didn't try to make an excuse. The phone was just straight up dead. Don't get me wrong, my little Craigslist deals went sideways all the time. People tried to haggle you down at the last minute or simply change their minds, so it wasn't like it was anything out of the ordinary. But a totally disconnected phone line. Very weird, and you can understand why that particular cancel stuck in my mind. Part 2. Like I mentioned previously, about 6 months after this little incident, my brother gets out of prison. As you can probably guess, it was a real intense time for our whole family, especially since he asked to move into my place until we could find a place to stay long term. I told him if he touched a drop of alcohol, he was out on his butt. But other than that, he could stay as long as he wanted. About 2 weeks into his stay, I was having a beer out on the porch after the kids had gone to bed when my brother came out to join me. I was a little apprehensive, thinking he might just be trying to get my guard down so he could ask for a beer or something. But I was just being paranoid, and we had a little heart-to-heart that night, me drinking Paps and him drinking Faygo. We talked about stuff he'd missed, how Mom and Dad really felt about his conviction, but most relevant to this story, we talked about his time in prison. It was a long, meandering conversation that honestly is a little hazy on my part thanks to the beers, but I remember mentioning something about how I felt bad for him, being locked up with all those scumbags. My brother's a jerk, but he's not a bad person. He was torn up after the accident, almost took his own life, and he took his jail time on the chin because he knew he deserved it. I just hated the idea of him being locked up with actual evil people that might hurt him, manipulate him, or coach him into being an actual criminal and not just some idiot who liked to drink too much. His reply kind of caught me off guard for a second because instead of telling me some story about talking to murderers or bank robbers, he says something like, "There's actually some pretty good guys in there, you'd be surprised." I guess maybe I would. I mean, my brother ended up inside. All he made was one dumb but dangerous mistake. But still, I just guffawed and told him to give me one credible example. Then, I swear to God, he starts telling me this story about this biker guy he'd shared a cell with for a few months. He wasn't just any old biker dude either. He was president of the local chapter of quite a well-known one-percenter club. Not the kind of guy you want to mess around with, but apparently also a man with a code. He once told my brother a story about how one of his associates found a guy selling a bunch of motorcycles. He planned to get the guy's address, roll up in the middle of the night, kill the guy selling them, then steal the bikes. The only reason they called the job off was because the associate had heard kids on the other end when he was talking to the seller on the phone. It took a minute for the penny to drop, but I remember interrupting my brother to ask where they'd seen the bikes advertised, and when he said online, I swear my heart rate went into overdrive for a second. I threw out a flurry of questions, asking him what website, what models the bikes were, where their prospective victims could have been located. My brother didn't have any answers to these questions, just a few vague answers before he hit me with a question of his own. I just straight up told him I thought the biker's mark was me, and I told him all about the bikes I'd won in the unit auction, how the buyers seemed to just drop off the face of the earth. To this day, I'm convinced it was me, and that the only thing that kept me and my family safe were the wails of my toddler. My brother doesn't seem to think that was the case and insisted that the bikers only targeted other bikers, kind of like the way the mafia only kill and rob other mafia guys. But I'm not so sure. Like I said, even these days I have this feeling in my gut that screams, "You dodged a bullet." I was always told that having kids would change my life. They just didn't tell me that it'd save my life at some point too.
My name is Lillian. I have 2 kids, a boy and a girl, who are everything to me. And what I'm going to report today happened to me a few years ago. Since I was a teenager, almost every night I had the same dream. But it wasn't just a repeated dream. It was more like a nightmare. I woke up scared and was afraid to go back to sleep. In the dream, I was going down a street with a very high wall. That's when I saw a gate that led to a huge cemetery. I went in and looked at the headstones, where there were all children of different ages. I became curious when I heard a baby cry. The further I walked, the further the exit became, and the clearer the baby's crying became, until I saw a child in a diaper crying on top of a grave, waving her arms and legs. I ran to try to help her, but when I arrived, I saw a deformed child. I can't explain how horrible it was to look at. In the dream, I couldn't get the baby. That's when I saw my aunt, who was still alive, and who, by the way, appeared from behind the grave and said, "What are you waiting for? Won't you take your child in your arms?" I was horrified. She took my arm and tried to make me put my hand on the baby. I screamed and started to run. The more I ran, the more the crying increased, but I still couldn't get out for some reason. I ran and ran between the decrepit graves, crying, and that agonized scream accompanied me. When I saw the gate, my aunt appeared in front of it with the baby in her arms. At that moment, I always woke up sweaty, desperate, and crying. I spent the day with that baby's cry in my head, and that was how it was for years. I always had a real panic to say that one day I would have a child, until I got pregnant at 20. I tried not to think about the nightmare, and tried to pray a lot, asking God for my child to be healthy. I realized during pregnancy that the nightmare didn't appear anymore. I was glad the torment of the night was over. My son was born perfect, with great health, while happiness reigned at home. The years went by, and I didn't remember that dream anymore, until one day. My son was 3 years old, and I got pregnant with my second child. But at 5 months, the ultrasound showed that he was going to be born with deformities. My world collapsed. The best thing the doctor said to do was to terminate the pregnancy, but I refused. I couldn't believe it because my son was part of me. A few weeks went by, and I woke up screaming and crying. The nightmare had come back, and this time much stronger. When I woke up, I was in huge agony, and that's when I realized that I was bleeding. I ran to the bathroom and ended up losing my baby. It was traumatic, and to this day, I don't understand what happened, but the life that followed, the nightmare stopped, and I was living my life in peace. Until my son was in a corner of the house, playing and talking to someone. I walked over and asked who he was talking to, and he replied, "You can't see, Mummy? It's my brother." I felt butterflies in my stomach. I tried to let it go. I thought he was imagining things, since the loss of my pregnancy was difficult for him, because he really wanted a brother. I picked him up and talked, but he insisted he was watching and talking to his brother. I called his attention not to say these things, because it wasn't funny and I didn't like it. So he shut up, and I took him to bed, as it was already past 10 p.m. When I was leaving the room, he asked me the following question. "Mummy, because my brother has a crooked face, he said I'm bothering you, and he loves you a lot more than I do. But Mummy, it's not true, because I love you so much more than anyone in the world." I hugged him, but his words bothered me deeply. I left the room feeling like I was being watched. I woke up a few hours later, hearing someone running around the house. I thought it was my son, who had gotten up. I looked at the door and saw a figure passing fast. I lost sleep instantly. My body shuddered and a shiver came over me. I got up running and saw when he entered where my son was sleeping. The lamp was on, and I ran into the bedroom. and that's when I saw a boy with sunken eyes looking at my son. I felt my blood freeze and despair seized me. That being looked at me without expression and said,
"I'm your son, you know."
His face instantly changed and he glared at my sleeping son. I took my son out of bed. He woke up scared and I ran with him to the exit door. That's when I heard a very strange voice saying,
"Don't leave me here."
My dog barked a lot and I was in a state of terror. I didn't get the keys and there was no way to open the door. I got a towel that was on the clothesline and I wrapped my son because he was cold that dawn. I tried to calm him down and with a lot of effort he slept on my lap. I sat there with him and my dog beside him looking at the house. In the morning, his father arrived and I explained what happened. He didn't believe me, but he knew I wouldn't be outside the house for no reason with the boy. We entered the house. Everything looked the same. I called my grandmother and told her what had happened. She said a very strong prayer and told me to calm down and go to church and light a candle for the child that was mine that couldn't leave me. I did what she asked and I confessed that nothing else happened. Today my son is 14 years old and doesn't remember this story. I had also forgotten until a few weeks ago when I saw a dark shadow around my son.